As a security professional, I don't look at buildings the way other people do. Many of the glass and steel structures rising in our cities have windows that are sealed and controlled environments inside. They have sophisticated heating and air conditioning systems. They have smart elevators. They have smart lighting. So you can see where I'm going with this. Each of these smart subsystems are controlled by different vendors. A breach in one could affect the other, and then, one day, the elevators stop working, the HVAC system fails, and suddenly, living on the 51st floor isn't so romantic. It's a nightmare. You have to walk up and down the emergency steps. How do you get groceries in? How do you take care of basic needs? And you can't open the window, so the air will get cold or hot, or definitely it'll get stale. And maybe you can't even open the door to your condo or office. Perhaps the building has been hit with a ransomware attack. This is a denial of service attack. The landlord pays, the system will start functioning again. Or maybe it won't. Or worse, what if it's a cascading failure, where one bad device corrupts the whole network? Then someone's got to figure out what failed. Kind of like serial Christmas tree lights. As I said, I no longer look at smart buildings the way other people do. Fortunately, there's a growing awareness that we have to secure all the systems, all the devices, and that includes IoT and OT devices. There are ways, like monitoring network traffic, to see what might be going wrong before it does. This is the story about why IoT and OT vendors need to stay on top of vulnerabilities, and why organizations need to specify security requirements up front in their procurement processes, particularly what the IoT and OT end of life might look like for those devices. I'm Robert Vamosi. This is Error Code.
I'm Chester Wisniewski, the Director and Global Field CTO at Sophos. Sophos is a global internet security company that's been in business for almost 40 years, and we provide all levels of enterprise and business security tools, from encryption to firewalls to endpoint security, EDR, and even services like managed detection and response.
In this episode, I'm going to focus a lot on IoT. I think it's been frustrating to me that, I've been in the space a long time. So why is it still an issue in 2024?
Boy, to answer the question about why people have been ignoring IoT security is a difficult one, because obviously the problem is the same today as it was 10 years ago, 20 years ago, other than the more ubiquitous nature of it. And I think that's part of maybe why it's getting attention these days. The idea that your elevators in your building or your Coke machine or all of these things are now probably connected to your Wi-Fi or in your network. And it's not just people joking about smart tea kettles and light bulbs. These are serious things that actually provide very valuable functions to a business, yet most often they're invisible or impenetrable by the IT teams to actually do anything about them. In fact, the first problem is even knowing you have them sometimes, because they just get plugged in. And, the risk is increasing for these, what we call active adversary attacks or hands-on attacks. These are not automated things anymore, just worms flying around your network looking for unpatched Windows machines. There's a human being looking for somewhere to hide so they can maintain persistence. And what better place to hide than the Coke machine that has a 5G connection as well and just doesn't have any security on it and will never have an EDR tool to detect that you're there.
Smart buildings is a subject that I don't get to talk about much. And I was wondering if Chester could maybe deconstruct that a little bit, in the sense that people don't think about the elevator or the Coke machines or any of the stuff that's in a building as affecting the overall smart building.
Well, yeah, I guess if you're trying to mess with people, that would be, there are probably lots of opportunities. I mean, I think, my understanding is most of these devices are being smart enabled, at least the more complicated ones like elevators and vending machines, as a maintenance monitoring situation. It can call home and say, hey, I have a problem. Somebody should come out and lubricate me next week, or, this type of thing, so that it can reduce moving from scheduled maintenance to required maintenance that saves money, makes things more efficient. When the vending machine is out of the diet soda, it can say, hey, I'm down to 5 cans. Time to send the guy over to fill me up, right? And I don't think those devices present too much mayhem opportunity. They are mostly probably just a security risk to the other devices that may be on the same network segments. Whereas obviously when we're talking about the lighting and the heating and cooling and things, it can be pretty messy. I guess the most famous ones that I've heard about was the hotel system locks being knocked out. And of course, that was a ransomware attack. It was probably not intentional. They weren't smart enough to go after the door locks but this is the thing, the unintended consequences are often the problem, right? Like the attacker doesn't have to be smart enough to mess with the HVAC system, but if it can't communicate with the controllers and can't tell what the temperature is in the room, it might just leave the air conditioning permanently on or the heat permanently on. Who knows what the default condition of that device is when the ransomware attack happens to take out the thermostat in every room in the building, or worse, if you're maybe a restaurant and it messes with the ability to keep the food cold in the chiller, or whatever's happening, right? And I think that's one of the design problems that I see most often is these devices are being integrated with the standard network because it's just easy, and they need access to the internet, I'll just put them on with all the other devices. And they really need to be in a separate VLAN segmented for this very reason. You don't want a ransomware attack period, but when it does happen, you don't want it making the lights and the thermostat not work.
Let's talk about an innocuous device sitting in a building that becomes a point to pivot onto other network devices.
Yeah, I think historically when we saw human attackers in a network, they would target often Linux and Mac computers for the same reasons, because they're generally underprotected or not protected. And if you were detected doing something to the Active Directory controller or whatever, and they detected you and booted you out, you still had a foothold because you could just sit there and keep reattacking from that Linux box or that Mac box. And I think IoT boxes are, well, let's be honest, IoT devices are primarily Linux devices anyway. They're just a more invisible version of the same thing that I think is also something you don't think about. Like, even if you're like, what if they're hiding on our Linux boxes? You might go scan them all or take a look at them. You're probably not going to look at the Otis elevator. We have to remember most of the criminals out there do not have the skills to understand industrial control systems, right? They come from the same backgrounds all the rest of us hackers come from, of playing around and hacking video games and doing whatever coming up through the years. And so they're familiar with commodity operating systems and commodity tools. And they're often not talented enough to develop their own exploits either. They're looking on GitHub for the proof of concept that somebody published. And we know that in particular IoT vendors, I think they're not usually software experts. They're usually hardware people that decided their thing needed to be on the internet, which means they're taking a free version of Linux they found somewhere that they'll never patch, that's probably already 4 years out of date, and just slapping it into their firmware and running with it. With of course, a default password just in case one of the maintenance people needs to get in. Which is why CISA and also in the United States, the Federal Trade Commission has been looking more and more at IoT devices. I was involved in some committees years back looking at like what are the basic things we can do. And it's like, well, for consumers, we're now talking about a trust mark where at least you can get an idea of, if I buy this smart device, it will get fixed or patches for X years, these kinds of things, so consumers can be more educated. But I think in the enterprise, we're looking at similar things to the Secure by Design initiative that was announced at RSA last year at CISA, by CISA, which I, disclosure, my company participates in. But part of Secure by Design is things like no more default passwords and, the automatic patching of the devices so that you don't have to remember to patch the vending machine and, this type of thing, because it's absolutely essential in IoT and especially considering the longevity of a device. It's one thing to have a laptop for 4 years that maybe presents some risk, but the investments you make in many of these, especially in industrial equipment, it's often a 25-year time frame. These are things that really do need some love and attention if they're going to be on the internet.
Chester mentioned the Coke machine and 5G. I'm not going to pick on vending machines per se, but I'm curious, what type of an attack would happen on a Coke machine?
I'm not an expert in that space, but from what we see, it's primarily being used as a staging point to go after the commodity computers on the network. And so it's staying pretty high level. It's at that Linux network level where they're just looking for a place to drop their toolkit and start exploring, scanning the network, looking for other things that are vulnerable that they can attack, because most of their skills are going to lie in the Linux and Windows realms. And if they're specialized enough to have understanding of how the PLCs work, there's probably better legitimate work that can be done. I mean, I guess it's important to differentiate between nation states and just criminal adversaries, right? Criminals are typically looking to do your standard ransomware style things, and they just want a place to hide. Whereas, obviously, if you're trying to cause disruption, and if we go down the Volt Typhoon rabbit hole, that's different, right? And at that level, clearly there is a understanding of how to manipulate the physical devices. And in a post Stuxnet world, every nation state, I'm sure, has invested in making sure they have similar capabilities, or at least are able to replicate what they see the most advanced nation states accomplishing. And I assume that Iran, Israel, the United States, India, Russia, China all have this capability.
And these devices are primarily point-to-point. They phone home and say, "Hey, I'm out of soda." Is there a holistic way of looking at a smart building and looking at all the devices?
From a security standpoint, I think the best approach for any large network now is to look at network detection and response, where you're actually passively monitoring the network for anomalous activity, because you're never going to intimately know the operating systems of all these little IoT widgets all over the place. But if one of them is calling home to a command and control server that's known to be operated by the Chinese MSS, that's probably something you want to pick up and go, we need to investigate which machine has that IP address. And you also have the ability to, there's a lot you can do from the network standpoint to kind of make sure these machines are staying between the lines on the road, where, and they often have incredibly predictable behavior. Like, as you say, that they're calling home to the local soda distributor, or they're calling home to the local maintenance office for the lifts. And therefore anything else they do should stick out like a sore thumb, right? And a very mature security team probably can lock them down to only communicating with a certain IP address or network range. And well, we used to do that kind of stuff, and the world's getting so much more complicated, because now they're going to go, well, yeah, we manage them all over Azure, and it's like, oh yeah, we'll just whitelist Microsoft, and now we've gotten nowhere. So these things are more complicated than they look, and that's why I think network detection and response is probably the future of looking at these devices from a traditional IT security standpoint, because we're never going to be able to list and enumerate every domain or IP address the thing is going to talk to, but its behavior should be somewhat innocuous and predictable. And when it's suddenly sending gigabytes instead of kilobytes, something's up.
Sophos has a new security report out on OT security. There was something in general that caught my eye. Attackers across the board have been moving towards credential stealing, literally walking in the front door and accessing systems directly. In the Sophos report, I see that in oil and gas ICS systems, there's a lean towards vulnerabilities. I was very interested in that, because there were specific vulnerabilities in things like communications protocols.
There are general vulnerabilities typically in remote access devices. So this is your VPNs, your remote access tools. The most common ones last year that were being targeted were like Fortinet VPNs or FortiGate boxes, Citrix. There was a famous vulnerability called Citrix Bleed.
In August of 2023, and perhaps even earlier, enterprises using Citrix NetScaler gateway appliances or their web application delivery controls were exposed to a vulnerability officially known as CVE 2023-4966, and informally known as Citrix Bleed. Citrix discovered and patched it in October, which meant that over the summer of 2023, enterprises were at risk for having their data breached. The technology at the heart of the issue is used for load balancing and secure remote access, services that are critical for many enterprises today. Citrix Bleed then opens the door for attackers to access sensitive information like employee passwords or session cookies, essentially bypassing any multi-factor authentication defenses. In some ways, this is like the buffer overflow response from Heartbleed. When a threat actor pushes a very large buffer into the host field of the HTTP request, a vulnerable version of Citrix Gateway pushes a large amount of unexpected data, including the last authenticated user's session cookie, to the HTTP response. This is very useful for ransomware attacks.
There's a high level of desire, especially in widely distributed OT networks to have lots of remote access, to not have to send people in the field to go deal with these things. You think about operating a railroad, you don't want to have to send a guy out to go check every switch that, you want to do all this stuff remotely. And of course, we all want to kind of be able to do it from our living room. If we have to be on call for something that happens at 3 a.m. in an emergency industrial network, we really don't want to have to pull our trousers on and run down to the office. And so we often set these things up in a convenient fashion. And unfortunately, in particular, OT staff have very little understanding of IT security. They think about physical threats. They think about boilers exploding because they went to 200C, or, they're thinking about a very different world of things that they're trying to protect against, even if they're security professionals. And they don't really understand that by turning on RDP on the control station for the water treatment plant, that it's going to be discovered by attackers in about 3 seconds, and no password they put on it's probably going to secure it, and they don't deploy multi-factor, and all the things that we would think about doing as modern IT professionals. They're not trained in that. And so I don't think we should blame them necessarily, but it's one of the reasons I think, IT teams need to have a very close relationship with their security counterparts in OT. Not that they're ever going to retrain them into understanding their world, but they can identify the risky spots. And, we have a service called Managed Risk that we specifically will actively monitor the network for seeing these things pop up and go, hey, by the way, that's going to get hacked real quick. We're going to alert you to the ones that are actively targeted, though, to your point, specific or general vulnerabilities. Well, it turns out, that vulnerability in that Siemens controller, there's like 12 people on Earth who know how to exploit it. So it's a risk, sure. And if you're running the nuclear plant, it's probably something that is not to be taken lightly. But in most cases, that's a pretty innocuous thing. Nobody's ever going to find it or touch it probably. And it's safe to perhaps defer it, if not ignore it. Whereas that Citrix gateway vulnerability is something that we saw attackers yesterday scanning the internet attacking, and we can help you stack rank those things. And it's like, yeah, sure, we found 12 things that are exposed to the internet that aren't great, but these 3 are being actively attacked, and these other 9 are sort of things that are background noise. And we never recommend you ignore them, but they can wait for the next change control window 2 months from now. Not a big deal. This one's actively exploited. Like, you're better off taking it down and having an outage for the next 2 hours while you fix it than you are leaving it there to know that it's going to be an active attacker in your network in a few minutes.
The Sophos report found that credential stealing was the second choice with oil and gas. And I found that kind of surprising, since it seems like, social engineering, it's so easy.
In most segments, the most common thing is stolen credentials. This shifts back and forth. Criminals prefer vulnerabilities to credentials because the vulnerabilities are able to be mass exploited. So if I find this, if I have this Citrix exploit, I'm not trying to specifically pick on Citrix here. I mean, I'm okay with picking on them a little bit, but it's just one that was commonly exploited last year. So if I have that, I can write a bot to just check every IP address on the internet and attack all of them at once. And that's what criminals do. And we saw this with Proxy Shell and Proxy Logger against Microsoft Exchange a couple years ago. We've seen this with many different products when a easily exploitable vulnerability is found. Pretty much every device on the internet is compromised within a day or two. And that automation is attractive to criminals because even if they get evicted from a third of them because they eventually get patched, or in a week later, somebody notices it's hacked and they do something about it, you've got this inventory, if you will. It's like, oh, well, we've got 10,000 and we compromised, 7,000 are still exploited. We can just, do whatever we want on whichever one we want. We can just look at it like a menu. It's like, okay, which companies do these belong to? Ooh, there's a big one. Let's target that one. Whereas the credentials are a little more complicated because you don't know what kind of privileges you're going to have as a given user. You don't know if they're still valid because some people do change their passwords sometimes. You don't know if there's multi-factor that's going to get in your way, and then you got to decide if you're going to try to bypass that or not. So I think they prefer vulns. And the reason we see more vulns in industrial environments than we see in other sectors like technology or finance or things like that is just that they're terrible at patching.
Staying with the ICS space, utilities in particular, I know ransomware groups have said, oh, we're not going to go after hospitals. That would be evil. But they do anyway. So what is the appeal of going after, say, a small municipal utility? Because oftentimes I'm thinking they're not very rich.
They're rich compared to the Belarusian who got in there. Stealing another person's money is always a good idea. if you're a thief, and any amount is generally okay. I mean, you could say the same thing about, we hear about a school being hacked every other day by these crews as well. And it's not, I don't think of the local public school as particularly wealthy, but they're very easy to apply an incredible amount of leverage against. And in the school example, we see lots of these, particularly in September when school first starts up. And, parents are like, yay, kids are back in school. I don't need daycare. Everything's ready to go. Oh, wait a minute. What do you mean the school's closed because of ransomware? And they're calling the principal going, you're paying the ransom. Like, you open that school. Kids are going to school. And I think it's no different with utilities. Like, I mean, are you going to cause a blackout? Are you going to cause a disruption to the safety of the municipal water system? You're pretty quick to go find some money. And it seems like I believe it's one of the highest percentages of paying ransom of all the sectors as well. So they may not be able to get there was a reported $75 million ransom paid last week. We don't know who allegedly paid it. Apparently a Fortune 50 company of some sort. Maybe you're not going to get a $75 million ransom from the local gas utility, but they'll be happy with $1.5 million.
So, having that discussion with IT, of discussing you're presenting a laundry list of vulnerabilities that are available, but telling them that they need to stack prioritize and know that these 4 are worth the time and energy, whereas the others, they're nice to have if they can get around to it. How does that often go? Is it receptive, or is it just overwhelming because they're not really coming from the OT space to begin with?
Well, I guess it's all based on the maturity of the organization's security programs, but I think the helping hand of these are the ones you need to pay attention to is pretty much welcome across the board, because it's I don't know what we're midway through 2024, and I think we're already over 20,000 CVEs this year. Obviously, most of those are just being logged in the record books and will never mean anything to anyone, but there's like 6 that matter, and I don't know how many this year in particular have been under active exploitation. I shouldn't say that 6, it's maybe more, but it's a handful. And, CISA in the United States has started this process for helping people out. They publicly publish a list called Known Exploited Vulnerabilities List, KEV list. So anybody in the world can just go on their favorite search engine and type in CISA KEV and easily find this list. Now, that's a pretty extensively long list still. That list is pretty much like everything we've seen attacked this year, as opposed to these 3 are attacked in minutes and these 5 were attacked 6 times that we observed at this one attack at this one time. So it's a more lengthy list, but it's a start. It's a start of like, you can at least get a reasonably good idea of where to put some of your attention. Because the problem is, you hire a pen testing firm or you do a external vulnerability assessment scan, and you get back this 25-page document of all your problems. And you go, what am I supposed to do with that? And unfortunately, the problem is the criminals can do the exact same thing and have the same 25-page list from you and go, right, we know how to do these 3. And if you haven't taken care of those, now you're in trouble. So the assistance with ranking those is generally welcomed, because nobody has enough time to do all the patching. Even as a security vendor, I think, our team does a pretty crack job, but still, like, how many, we might only have 5,000 employees, but we probably have 25,000 computers and so many test beds and random things that people spin up that we constantly have to discover that somebody put on the network without filing the right paperwork, and so that we can keep track of it and fix it and protect it. And every business has this problem. So a helping hand, I think, is generally welcomed. The issue is some people see it as like, a perfectionist thing that they need to check all the boxes. And that's probably a bad practice, to be honest. I mean, I'd never discourage anyone from wanting to patch all of their problems, but the truth of the matter is you got 40 hours in a week. And if you get the most important ones, the other 10 hours, 20 hours you have left is much better spent probably on other types of activities, like more careful monitoring, those kinds of things, so you can do early detection rather than worrying about trying to swat every single bug.
The KEV list is valuable, but it doesn't get into industry-specific stuff. So, for a utility that is starting out and looking into the vulnerability space, probably someone has to sit and go through all of those and say, oh, well, we don't use this, or we do, but not that particular version, and so forth. It just becomes a manual chore, does it not?
Yeah, and I mean, obviously, there's companies that specialize in helping organizations do this stuff, like Dragos, and there are some fantastic experts out there that can help those organizations with sifting through that stuff. It's not something that our company does, but I'm fortunate enough to be friends with many of the people that do these things that are all here at Black Hat this week, and they're fantastic folks, and not just Dragos, of course, but their competitors as well. It's always good to have an expert in your space at your side to help you out with it. But yeah, it can be tough. And this is one of the things that, there's a lot of move toward what's called SBOMs, or software bill of materials. And I've got a lot of strong opinions on that topic, because they do create more of this wild goose chase problem, where many of these devices, especially modern ones, for example, will include OpenSSL, because they'll do some encryption over their communication. Yay, finally encryption in industrial devices. You get excited. I get excited about that idea, but the problem is 5 or 6 times a year, there's a vulnerability in OpenSSL, and usually it's in some obscure hashing function that's used on like 6 computers in the world that just happens to be in OpenSSL, but it's in your SBOM. So you get your list and you're like, this device is vulnerable. It's got OpenSSL. Well, it turns out it's not vulnerable. It's never used that hashing function. It's just there, but it's on your list. And so that's where the problem is. There's so much noise with any tool that's trying to automatically tell you all your things. Like, these tools mean well, but they generate these voluminous lists that the only way to work through them is by hand. And sometimes the only way to work through them is by filing tickets with your vendor to go, well, I see that my PLC controller has this vulnerable library. Is it actually vulnerable? And it's like, no, it's not vulnerable. But the only way to find out is like contact them or log into their portal. I mean, this is not something that can be automated or is easy.
And there's a difference between static analysis and dynamic analysis. Just because the code is there doesn't necessarily mean that it's running.
Well, that's precisely it, right? And we have a tendency to use a lot of commodity open source things in a lot of these tools. And in a way that's good, because often, the community is working hard to build secure versions of those things, because we're all relying on them. But it also means they have 700 functions, of which you're using 2. And that only the exploit only really matters if it's those 2.
And then there's the implementation and configuration. There are other layers there too. So just because you've identified a package, to get to your point, it doesn't mean that it's running or that it touches anything else that's sensitive.
Yeah, and I don't know the security knowledge of all of the listeners, but we look at things like a local privilege escalation vulnerability. Well, in order to exploit that, you have to be able to already get on the device. So with a lot of these, industrial controllers, it's probably hard to get on the device. You probably don't need to worry about a local privilege escalation, but you would worry about a remote code execution. And so you have to know the lingo and kind of become a bit of, get down into the weeds on security nomenclature to work your way through it as well.
There's also the commercial side of IoT. And we talked a little bit about labeling. This is voluntary, and it's coming forward in the IoT space. How does Chester feel it's going to play out in the market?
There's a segment of the community that wants to make better choices and doesn't have the information to do so. And this is a good start to help those people, but it's not everyone, right? Like, we have nutrition labels on our food, and I would venture a guess that I've seen very little people turning away the Twinkie because it says it has 431 calories on the package. You have to want to, and you have to know what it means. But on the other hand, somebody who does care and walks into a Best Buy down the street and wants to get a new router for their house, and they go, which one? And if one has a sticker on it that says that it meets certain security qualifications and it's going to get updates for 7 years, and one doesn't, they might be willing to spend $20 more for the one that they know is going to get updates. And I think this model is starting to be proven by seeing what's happening in the mobile phone space. With Samsung's, I think, giving 7 years of updates now on their premium devices. And that's an incentive to buy the $1,000 phone instead of the $300 phone for some people. Like, hey, I don't like getting a new phone all the time, and I want to keep it for a long time. And if they're going to give me the security updates and I feel safe with it, I'll spend a little bit more and get the fancy one with the nicer camera, and I'll use it for 5 years, 6 years, 7 years. And, Google's doing similar, Apple's doing similar. And I believe that's sort of paving a road for thinking about these things. And I think the first generation of IoT devices now is, starting to bite people in the butt at home, and that it's all relies on the cloud. And someday it's not profitable to provide free cloud service to your light bulbs anymore. And they just turn it off. And suddenly I can't control my light bulbs anymore. What happened? Well, the company in China that sold me the $4 LED light bulb decided they didn't want to run their cloud anymore. And it's not profitable to run it without a subscription. And everybody's like, well, I don't want to pay a subscription. Well, it's not free to run the cloud. So something's going to break. You're going to pay per subscription. It might be there forever. Or you pay a really premium, like maybe you buy Philips and you pay 4 times as much for the light bulb. Maybe it'll work for its lifetime. But the $3.99 one on Alibaba, not so much. And so I think consumers need information to start making choices. This device works without the cloud. This one requires the cloud. That's a choice I want to know about before I buy something, because I prefer, if my internet goes down, to still be able to control my heat pump. And I'll spend more money. I'll be happy to pay a premium for a product that, I mean, I'm fortunate enough to be able to afford to. Not everybody can afford to, but I can't make the choice on the typical box. So anything that we do to help people make choices, at least people who want to be informed are able to start voting with their dollars for things that do things the way we want them done.
Chester brings up an interesting point. At DEF CON 32, immediately after Black Hat USA 2024, there was a panel discussion around the end of life for IoT devices, and the fact that that information, if it does exist, is often not publicly disclosed. To Chester's point, one day you might wake up and you can't control something because, well, the vendors decided it's end of life, and there's no more support for it. I guess the labeling then is a step toward transparency, right?
I don't think the labeling goes far enough, in my opinion. I was voting for stronger labeling that had more details for people to make informed choices, but it's a step in the right direction, I think. If it's at all successful and the vendors see that they feel like they have a competitive edge by complying with the program, then perhaps we'll see more iterations that perhaps advance it further down the road. I like playing and hacking with these IoT devices myself as a hobby. It's not part of my job to do so, but I still do it. And when I used to come here to Las Vegas for Black Hat, there used to be a large electronics outlet down the street called Fry's Electronics that people in Western United States will be familiar with. And they're no longer in business, but they had a lot of cheap garbage, and I loved it because I can't get that stuff where I live in Canada. So I would be down here, and I'd always take a taxi down to Fry's and just load up on $7 IoT widgets that I knew I was going to be able to hack when I took them home because they were all going to be really terrible, and I'd have fun with them. And my favorite one was a light bulb, TCP brand light bulb, and I'm like, it can't be a coincidence that it's on the network and it's a TCP brand light bulb. And by the time I got home, it was already discontinued. The cloud that operated it was down before I managed to get back to Canada. And then I looked into it, and of course, this company in China, sells these under like 37 different brand names on Alibaba and Amazon and other discount outlets in Europe and other places, right? So I was actually able to hack it into using a different brand's cloud because they were all using the same software. So I could at least change the color of it once and get it the way I wanted before I installed it in a socket in my house. But I mean, this is the world we were living in, and I think a lot of early adopters and techie people that like to play with stuff have early generation IoT stuff that's now starting to face these problems. So I think it's raising awareness about this as an issue.
Also at Black Hat, there was a session on EV stations being attacked, and they were citing a couple common brand names in the EV station space. I'm wondering if we might be reaching a tipping point where companies start to say, yeah, we have all these CVEs and look, we fixed them all. So we're much more secure and transparent than that other guy over there who's not saying anything about their security model or whether they've had any vulnerabilities and if they've been patched. Really, the security disclosure, I think at some day it could become a popular selling point, right?
I think I would shy away from CVE counting, because it doesn't mean anything to speak of, because every vendor does them so differently that they aren't terribly meaningful, right? Like, is Mac more secure because Apple released 8 CVEs and Microsoft released 100 last year? Could be, but probably not, because when Apple does a CVE, they fix 27 things in one, and Microsoft files 27 CVEs. So we shouldn't get too much into the measurement that way, but absolutely on the theme of what you're saying, I think transparency is essential. And there's a lot of talk about supply chain security right now. There's a lot of talk about, well, sure, it's great to say I'm going to buy from this company. They've got ISO 27001. Okay, that's nice. But it doesn't really mean that much. How do you know what their real internal practices are? You don't. Like, certifications are a start, but we all recognize that SOC 2 and ISO 27001 and other things are really the beginning of the journey and not really indicative of a strong security culture. So how do I judge? And, one of the things I tell organizations is transparency. Like, when was the last time they were hacked, and what did you read the root cause analysis report on what happened? Oh, there wasn't one. Well, I can guarantee you their software was hacked once. What if there isn't one? That's a warning flag. Like, if they're not being transparent with you. Now, maybe they'll provide it on request, and you can ask them. Maybe they'll give you a really good report on request. Maybe it's not on their website. That's probably all right. But those are the kinds of things you start looking for. You're like, well, when you release updates, does it say security updates, or does it say fixed a local privilege escalation bug in the authentication portal? So if when you get the release notes, if they just go bug fixes, that's very different than a detailed thing. And when you start seeing those details, you're like, they're being open and transparent. It's very likely they're on the ball. They know how important these things are. They know that discerning people, discerning shoppers know the difference and care. And by being transparent, they are showing that they're running a mature program. And so I think transparency is essential, but I wouldn't get into how many vulns are patched kind of thing, because things also reach a mature part of their lifetime at some point, right? Like, we had an old email product that I used to work on when I first started 20 years ago. Not that my career goes back more than 20 years. I've been at Sophos more than 20 years now. So when I first started at Sophos 21 years ago, I was working on an email product that we have. And, it reached a maturity point 15 years into its lifetime where we'd stopped adding features years ago, and it just was humming along. And like, the amount of patches a year had dropped to a very small number because we weren't introducing change. When you introduce change, you introduce risk. So the more changes, the more features, the more things you're releasing all the time, you're always going to have more risk, more vulnerabilities, more things to patch. And when the things really, reach that approaching end of lifetime in the maturity model, they're typically incredibly secure with a very low number of patched vulnerabilities coming out. So more patches might mean more risk.
Another aspect of end of life is the continued use of older operating systems. Often there is little or nothing that can be done about upgrading those devices, particularly when they cost millions of dollars in the first place.
I work with a local technical college, and they have a CNC machine that was $3 million that they bought in like the 90s that they used to teach students on, and they're not going to replace that thing. They can't afford to in any meaningful way. And, I was joking when we were getting ready to do the podcast about Windows 95, but it runs Windows 95 because that's the generation when it came out. That software is never going to run on anything else. And they're looking at like, how do we mitigate the risk of this thing being on our network, right? Because obviously every vulnerability that's been patched after Windows 95 stopped being patched 25 years ago is now exposed on this thing. And somebody with ill intent would probably have a pretty easy time getting into it. And I really think in these environments, we need to look at using virtual machines so that you can sort of encapsulate the software in a box that you put on something that can be patched, right? So you run a modern Windows 11 or a modern Windows Server 2019 or something like this server, and then on it you run a virtual machine that has the Windows 95 that runs the machine, so that it's sort of encapsulated in a secure device itself, and then you can isolate it much more easily from being a risk and a threat on the network. And I don't think we talk about that enough, that it's unreasonable to expect a device with a 25-year lifetime to get 25 years of patching. That's just not a thing that's going to happen. And unfortunately, in the really old days, these things ran proprietary operating systems and nobody knew how to hack them. So you were safe by security through obscurity. But now they're using commodity stuff. Whatever they can buy today for $300 from Dell or whatever is what they're going to base it off of. And that thing is going to be very hackable in the near future. And so we should be looking at, I think, containerization and virtualization, things like this to help extend the life of those physical things that work just fine, but try to minimize their harm to our IT environments.
If a device is running Windows 95, well, I guess it's on the device that controls a thing versus the device itself.
Right? Because in this case, it's a computer, a regular commodity computer running Windows 95 that through a cable connects to and talks to the thing and controls it. In that case, you can virtualize it. But if the device itself has software on it, you're beholden to the vendor forever. And that's a different situation. And that's more what we see in medical, for example. You look at an MRI machine or this type of thing, it's got generally an embedded computer that's made by Philips or General Electric or whomever manufactured it. And you're kind of stuck with them. And now you're looking at educating your legal team so that when you're creating your contracts, that you're ensuring that that vendor is legally obligated to help you protect that device and make sure it's not presenting a risk to you for its usable lifetime. And that needs to be a strict part of contract management and procurement. And most large organizations that can afford these devices have procurement people. That's all they do. But they often aren't security people. And we need to work with our IT security teams, need to educate those procurement experts on what we expect to be able to provide safety in those environments from a software standpoint.
I'd like to thank Chester for coming on the show and talking about IoT and OT devices and how we got to start looking at the security from the beginning to the very end of their life cycle. Hey, if you're enjoying Error Code, tell a friend. I'm sure there are other people out there who like narrative information security podcasts. And I'd really like to hear from you. Join us on Discord. Search for Error Code Podcast to join the server, or go to errorcodepodcast.com to get more details. And tell me what you like, and even what you don't. I have more conversations coming up. I'll have conversations about Secure by Design and more about Operation Volt Typhoon. Subscribe today. I don't want you to miss out.